So, welcome to our Live Loved meetup. I'm Rachel. That's Laura. We're glad to have you with us. um, and tonight, we're going to start like we do many nights. I'm going to do a little catch up. We're looking at this book, Made for This, by Jenny Allen. And it's a dangerous little book. I gotta say, it's a dangerous little book. It talks about 40 days of living into your purpose and what happens when you pray prayers like anything. God, I will do anything that you would have to live not a purpose. This is so contrary, and I don't want to get completely off topic, so I'm going to try really hard not to. This is a team made up of a tribe of women who somehow, somewhere stumbled upon Plexus supplements and found not only health, not only found a community, but also found, for many of them, a purpose bigger than themselves. And I think what has become so clear to me is there's a difference between the saying you are made for more and you are made for this. I have become really protective over my space of trying to keep it free of hustle. I don't want to be a hustler. That was never in the makeup of who I feel like I've been designed for. The idea of made for more always made me feel like I was actually living less, and always made me feel like I have to do more and know more and have more influence and always more. Like, when is enough with being made for more? But made for this is different, because made for this says you don't have to be more. It's actually about becoming and releasing exactly the you that you have always been made to be. The you that lives inside, that has God's fingerprint and DNA all over you. And uncovering buried treasure of all that the world has buried on top, that longs to keep small and hidden. And living for this means ultimately you're not living for your own purpose. You're not living for high dollar bank accounts or fancy prizes or glitzes or glam. You're actually living for a purpose that is an eternal purpose that bears out eternal promises. And along the way, sometimes that means that you can have financial support for your family and to be able to do some things, but more it's about being a conduit of His grace and His goodness. And so we're looking at day 11, and it's called Purely Devoted. And it starts out with Galatians 1:10, and Galatians 1:10 says, if I were still trying to please people, if they were my focus, I would not be a servant of Christ, because people are not the focus. He is. And this chapter is full of some hard-hitting punches. It says things like this: we were built for the greatness of God, but left to ourselves and our own honesty, we love being great more than we love making God great. So whether you're building up your own name or you're just too scared to build anything because you don't want to look egotistical, both mindsets are wrong. I've talked to enough of you to know that many of you are literally sitting on your gifts. The enemy is subtle, and he loves to warp truths into lies. He tells us that we're being humble, responsible, and selfless while we're killing the things God put us on the planet to do. the things that would build his kingdom. So how do we fight? Because the idea is we are fighting. We are fighting the urge to hide or fighting the urge to be too full of ourselves. How do we fight? She says the answer is the same. We have to get over ourselves. We have to get over ourselves. It's either just stinking pride of worrying so much about what others will think about us. And here's where I do a little segue, because I really do believe that with Plexus, you have purpose. And I'm going to go into that. No apologies, no holds barred tonight. Probably more so than how I have done probably ever, because I've honestly walked this fence of fear of breaking my ethical boundaries and not really truly grasping and understanding what a pronounced opportunity we have truly to change lives. And so somehow, somewhere, God has shaken some more cobwebs out of me and has said, Rachel, you need to get over yourself. It says, soon no name on earth will matter but one, and it's not yours, and it's not mine. And that one name has asked you to build with him. And who wouldn't trade building sandcastles to get to build something that lasts forever and ever and ever? So we're going to be talking about banking on meaningful work. Tim Keller, he's an author / theologian / pastor, speaks meaningful work as taking the raw materials we're given and assembling them in such a way that causes other people to flourish. That's meaningful work. We take the raw, ragged, sharp, twisted edges that we are given. It's not all sunshine and roses. Sometimes it's pain. Sometimes it's our hardest stuff. And somehow we hold it and we assemble it with the leading of the Spirit to create something that causes other people to flourish. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk tonight. I had posted that we're going to do what I would call a deconstructivist view, where we dissect different traditional westernized cultural views of our traditional medical as well as traditional mental health world, of how we look at people in a very compartmentalized way, and kind of shake that tree a little bit. So what I'm asking is a posture of just holding your hands out and asking the question of curiosity and what if. I'm not asking for a debate. I'm not saying I'm completely right or something else is completely wrong. I'm saying what would happen if we just allowed ourselves a moment of curiosity in the idea of what wholeness might look like beyond our segmented views of health, okay? And I'm going to pick first a little bit about the lane that I'm most familiar with, and that lane is the lane of mental health. You know, I've devoted all of my professional life to the field of mental health. Really, truly, I can't remember a time when I wasn't envisioning getting into a helping profession of sorts. And mental health just kind of became the natural outflow of where I saw I could do the most good. I'm a helper by nature. And, you know, I got into the profession 15 years ago with that goal of trying to do the greatest good with my life as much as I could, really wanting to focus on children and families. And if I'm really honest, in my graduate school training, there wasn't a ton of training on trauma, and somehow, somewhere, early developmental attachment and trauma became my specialty. And so what that means is I spend most of my day looking at the narratives, the stories of how people entered into the world with their early most relationships, and looking at story after story of pain, of brokenness. And along the line, this lens of trauma specifically, and an attachment, which looks at how the brain, while it's developing in its early most developmental stages and throughout the lifespan, and the body learn to become wired together. And this journey has really sort of ruined me from so much of the traditional Western worldview. It's actually kind of ruined me with my classical profession and training. And this is probably why I've approached this topic with kid gloves, sensitivity, and a whole lot of fear. Because really, over the last 8 years, I've been asking some very tough questions and feeling kind of disgruntled with many things in my profession. And so I feel like a little bit of the Wizard of Oz, like pulling the curtain back, allowing people to see a behind the curtain view of what's frustrating for myself with my own profession. And the first thing I'm going to say is the first thing that I have been taught is most of how we diagnose clients is through a manual. It's in its 5th edition now. It's called the DSM Manual for Diagnosis. And I have had a sort of falling out with my diagnostic manual for a long time. I've been very disgruntled with how diagnosis is made, and I couldn't really put my finger specifically on what the issue was until I read this book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's a highly, highly respected clinician, researcher, physician who studies trauma. I mean, he is kind of like a granddaddy. I mean, he's a big deal, you guys. And so this book is all about lots and lots of research about how trauma impacts the mind and the body from a very holistic perspective. And he kind of hit the nail on the head for me when he said, you know, so much of who we see when we use our DSM manual to place a diagnosis on a person, it's highly subjective. So the manual itself, in its very first printing, said in its preface that any of the codes listed in the book should not be used for insurance diagnostic purposes. It actually said that directly. This book should not be used for the purposes of billing. That book is entirely what we use for coding and billing. And what's tricky and sticky about this is the world, the brain is so complex. And the diagnoses, if we're honest, are really subjective. So they're really dependent on the bent and training of a given clinician, doctor, psychiatrist, and what stuff they bring to the table. So if I saw a child or an adult who was having struggles with concentration, impulsivity, forgetfulness, had a hard time sitting still, had internal motor that was constantly set to go, and my bent was towards ADHD, like my passion, my training was really geared towards ADHD, I probably would say that person, I'd give them a few tests, right? And I probably would say that they have ADHD, and I would send them on their way to a physician for them to have ADHD medication or stimulants like Ritalin, etc. But if I were a different type of therapist with training who, again, saw impulsivity and said, gosh, you have really erratic sleep patterns. Again, you're very impulsive. Your mood is very variable. I might be more inclined to say, let's really look closely at this. This is looking a bit like bipolar. And send you on your merry way again. And you would likely have a whole different set of medication for your bipolar disorder, and you would then carry the label bipolar. And I could go on and on. And this is why so many different providers have a long list of things and letters: ADHD, ODD, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, borderline personality disorder. They're subjective, you guys. There's not a one written in stone absolute diagnosis for these things. And so it always feels a little shifty and a little shaky, even though we as clinicians try our very, very best. The other thing that has been really hard, okay, with the diagnosis is that people carry those diagnoses for life. It can impact their jobs. It can impact their medical benefits. It can impact their sense of self. I so often have people in my office who say, my name is Jane Smith. I have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Therefore, I'm a hot mess without any hope. You might as well just know I'm a hot mess express for life. That is not what diagnoses are for. And in fact, here's the other thing. More times than not, when I get below the surface of a diagnosis, there's actually story after story after story of pain. And we might say, what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? The pain or the diagnosis. I really do see that more often than not, it's the story pain. And Dr. Vanderkolk says the same thing. He talks about when he was in his residency and he worked at a hospital and he was a peon, right? He actually interacted directly with patients who were really severe. They were hospitalized for schizophrenia and, manic bipolar and schizoaffective disorder and all sorts of things that we as clinicians would say are this hard stuff that there's not a lot of hope for. And what he found is that before finding out their diagnosis, he interacted with them and he found out they all had stories. And most of them were really, really traumatic and painful. But you see, my DSM manual doesn't allow room for understanding relational pain. It doesn't leave room for understanding developmental trauma or long-term medical trauma. It doesn't really understand how things like sensory processing disorder affect a child's brain and put them into a hypervigilant state, which becomes their way of being in the world. creating a whole different wiring of the brain and the nervous system, and really truly how they believe that the world is. They believe that the world is a threatening and scary and overstimulating place. And every part of their body changes in response to that understanding. And that, my friends, is the case of so many of the clients that I see. It is really the exception of a person who comes in who says, yeah, I lost my job and I have, I have stress from that. No, it's usually more of the chronic, long-term identity stuff that only gets shaped from pain, right? And I don't have a code for that. I don't have a code for that. And that makes me really sad, because then I have to use all of these other codes that Dr. Vanderkolk says are just the symptoms. They aren't the root cause. So much of my profession does very little with recognizing the root cause, giving it a name, holding and sitting in pain. Now, there's a lot of professionals that do that. It's just the system that doesn't give it name, doesn't take it seriously, leaves it out of our manuals. And so there's a lot. There's a sense of, like I said, when you begin to understand that brains are a part of bodies, that are a part of human hearts, that are a part of connection and disconnection with others, and you begin to realize that every area is impacted by pain and by emotional pain. We can call the emotional pain chronic stress, which I don't know anyone, if I'm honest, that isn't struggling with chronic stress. It's a really hard time to be an actual human being, especially a developing human being in our culture. There are so many demands. There are so many tools for dissociation and isolation. There's not really time for taking care of one's body or taking things like sleep as a necessity to be protected and affirmed. There's less and less spontaneous play. In fact, there's researchers right now who are saying children growing up today have lost the innate ability to play and to be imaginative and creative, which, by the way, that's the development of empathy. And I don't mean to scare the bejeebers out of you, but that does scare the bejeebers out of me. It also means that clinicians don't really have the ability to explain the role of chronic stress and trauma on what it means for the body, on how it actually changes brain chemistry, and how chronic stress and early trauma, all one needs to do are read books like this, books like this, books like this, to begin to understand that the pain that we carry in our hearts and in our souls absolutely plays out in our hormones, in our nervous system, in our cells, in the ability to detoxify, which has everything to do with cellular aging and cellular death. That has to do with our gut system. I'm going to pull this little graphic up. It's one I shared with my team, but I think it's really, really important. So give me just a second. So this one, so this graphic, and you can see is through the Echo Company. Hey, babe, you give me a kiss? I'll come and kiss you. Good night, okay? Love you. Yeah, I will come. All right. So this infographic breaks down the physical impact of trauma on the entire body. I would say the same things that are impacted through through trauma, which would be things that we would traditionally view as traumatic, like forms of abuse, neglect, traumatic incidences like tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, car accidents, sudden deaths, but also including medical trauma, also includes being a child with a parent with mental illness like postpartum depression, children born with parents who work 2 or 3 jobs who aren't available, children who have parents who have substance abusing tendencies, frequent moves. We could even add things like bullying, chronic bullying to this list if we're talking about impacts of trauma on children. But certainly we would say that chronic stress is a form of trauma. It's an assault on the brain and the body and carries the same sort of changes. So going to a job that you abhor, having marital stress or distress, right? Being chronically lonely, not connected to community and in isolation would fall on this list. So please know that trauma is much larger than what we often would give it credit for. And again, I would say many of our children with special needs, especially our sensory processing disordered children, children on the spectrum, would suffer the same sorts of physical assaults on their brains and their bodies. So I'm just going to take a minute and break these down for you, just for a little perspective, so you know what's happening. And this is a very simplified version, so some of the resolutions are pretty simple as far as seeing them on a page, not necessarily simple in their implementation. So you can see one of the main physical impacts of trauma in the way that I have defined it is, first of all, the actual brain architecture, the actual brain structure is changed. The part of the brain that is changed is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part from the eyeballs on up. It's the part that is used for learning, for communicating, for problem solving and sequencing, for regulating and modulating reactivity and mood. Also, the corpus callosum that goes right down the middle, and the hippocampus, responsible for memory storage, as well as an enlarged and more reactive amygdala, which is our stress or fear-based, and I would also say shame-based response center of the brain, are actually changed. So shrinkage of the part of the brain that allows for us to self-regulate and plan and sequence and problem solve and utilize verbal language to express our needs gets smaller, and the part of our brain that gets larger is the part where our fear and our fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain is located. It's a very reactive part of the brain. And of course, here it says that what is helpful or safe and stable, nurturing relationships, being in nature, positive touch, exercise. There's actually some research too that food can help. Eating foods that are low in inflammation can be really helpful with this part of the brain, as well as eating high fat, healthy fats can be very protective for this area of the brain. You see neural pathways actually get rewired So thought patterns and habits of our thoughts and our conscious mind and unconscious mind get rewired much more to a reactive nature, to a negative nature, to a nature that is much, the world is scary and negative, and I am vulnerable and at risk sort of thought pattern. You can see that the hormones change. So one thing that happens with the impact of chronic stress and trauma is that there's a prolonged sense of cortisol, and ghrelin, which is actually a hunger hormone, is released, creating a greater reactivity to stress. So and cortisol is always in relationship with other hormones, especially insulin. So if cortisol is high, that's going to have a direct impact to how the body is using fuel and how it converts energy in the cells. It's looking for cheap fuel because it's needing to burn a lot of gas at a very quick rate. Meaning that there's much higher likelihood of ups and downs, pretty dramatic with blood sugar instability. And you can see that the long-term result is actually damage to the cells, damage to structures of the body and other hormone glands, which is why for my people that have endured early childhood trauma, or have endured chronic stress for a long period of time, they are at great risk for hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's concerns. Toxin elimination is decreased, so the intestines and the kidneys are less able to eliminate toxins. And also know that if your body is in a constant state of stress, your gastrointestinal system is not working optimally. It shuts down because there are other more pertinent survival parts of the body that need to be cared for and be put into high gear. And so the digestion shuts down, leading to things like chronic constipation and or chronic diarrhea. Again, the nervous system is changed. So the fight, flight, or freeze sympathetic nervous system is continuously turned on. And the calming, relax, chill, turn down your heart rate, be able to breathe in and breathe out and relax, respiration, parasympathetic nervous system begins to become not engaged at all, meaning that the system is incredibly out of balance. The immune system takes a hit because when your body has dramatic cortisol levels, there are actually messengers released in the body called cytokines, which increase inflammation all throughout the body, causing many diseases like asthma, arthritis, fibromyalgia. A lot of chronic autoimmune conditions stem from this. Notice actual brain waves change. Notice your neurotransmitters change. The vulnerability to addiction, because dopamine receptors are underdeveloped, so there's a constant seeking for a high. This also reduces motivation and focus, lots of fatigue, and low serotonin, which results in depression. And even cellular changes. So you can see scientists measure telomeres, and telomeres are actually tell us about our aging, right? And so when we have this chronic stress, our telomeres are shortened prematurely, which again reduces reproduction of cells and actually can be a direct link towards cancer. So look at what we're doing. We're seeing that there is a direct impact between what happens with our stress response system and our actual physical bodies, which goes into my picking on, let me come back to you, which comes back to the second area, which has been a struggle for me, which is looking at our traditional medical view. And I know Laura is a nurse, and I have great respect for my doctor and nurse friends. Most of them are in the profession as helpers as well, but are also in a system that is hard, because there's not always a lot of emphasis on time in learning about the story that undergirds so much of those things that I just mentioned, right? Very often doctors they're evaluated by their productivity, and they have to get in so many clients or patients per day to get the payments that the hospital or the doctor's office needs. And so they don't have the old school time to sit face to face for an hour with their patients and learn what is the story behind so many of these illnesses or ailments. I do have to say our traditional medical system is one of the world's best in the treatment of acute needs. It's more of the chronic illnesses that are more of a struggle, especially like so many of those that I mentioned that have their origins beginning outside of the physical body, but become translated in with and through the physical body. The story here, this has really become, I think, one of my underscoring whys of why I share so diligently, really about the effects of trauma and the hope that we can give for people, and actually the hope of what things like how supplements can play a huge part in this world. I shared this story with my team because I feel like this was really the beginning of when I started asking so many of these questions. So the story looks like this. 8 years ago, I was pregnant with my second son. His name is Hayden. He is a joy and a delight and effervescent little boy, right? He's as rough and tumble as they come. But when Hayden was born, he was really, really sick. And about the same time that I was pregnant with Hayden, I was really becoming a researcher about the role of stress and trauma, just like I'm talking to you, and how that lodges in the body. And when I had Hayden and he was sick, he had to spend the first month of his life in the NICU. We didn't know if Hayden would ever come home, if he would survive. He was one of the sickest of the sick babies. Had sepsis, respiratory distress, pneumonia, lots and lots of issues in his little body. And as a mom, that was really, really difficult. But as a mom / clinician that understands the role of trauma in the developing mind and body of a child, it was unbearable. It was unbearable because I felt so incredibly helpless. Because on the one hand, I was completely dependent on medical care, and they kept my child alive and they did wonderful things for him. But while at the same time, the constant barrage of sticks and pokes and the very tube that was down his throat that allowed him to breathe also required for him to be on drugs, morphine and fentanyl, and things that were addictive to his little body and his system, and created changes in his body. The fact that I couldn't hold him, I couldn't touch him for the first 7 days of his life. Again, me knowing how pivotal that skin-to-skin touch is for him and for his mama in our attachment wiring and his development was incredibly hard. Well, after day 30, we were able to take Hayden home. And I was watchful And I was aware that there was going to have to be some work that we were going to have to do at home to help his brain and his body catch up to some of the things and to rewire some of the things. Now, I call myself fortunate in that sense because most people don't have that understanding. The wiring is really, really important. And it wasn't very long before we started, his dad and I started to notice that Hayden was not positively responsive to touch. He wouldn't cuddle in, he would actually arch back. He was not easily comforted. He was pretty adversive actually to things like touch and was easily overstimulated. He had really kind of a glazed look about his eyes. And at night, in the middle of the night, he would shriek for hours upon hours at end, where he would be really, again, rigid and arch his back, and have night terrors. That you literally could not wake him up from. And they would last for upwards of an hour or more. And they were terrifying. And there wasn't anything that you could essentially do. You couldn't wake him. And so I did what most moms would do. I took him to the doctor, right? Because I wanted to rule out organic causes like acid reflux, making sure that there wasn't a physiological reason. But in the back of my mind, I knew there's trauma here. And I visited several doctors and I posed the question, and this was 8 years ago, but no doctor really took me seriously. And in fact, the last doctor that we went to was such a painful encounter. I actually showed the doctor the video that I had taken on my phone, because I knew I wanted the doctors to see what I was talking about, that I wasn't just a hysterical, crazy mom. And so I brought in the video and I showed it to him. And I'll let you hear just a snippet of the video. I won't play it very long. I still think it's troubling to myself, honestly, to hear it. One second. So I'm just going to play it for you. So what we would notice, let me come off, stop share. What we would notice is that if we held him, it didn't matter. If we tried to comfort him, it didn't matter. He would have this hands out and shaking in front of him, and that wailing would continue. And I remember I went to the last doctor and I was just broken. I was tearful. I didn't know what to do. I felt like maybe I'm crazy, like questioning myself in 1,000 different ways. And the doctor gave me an answer that was both heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. And please hear me. I don't blame, I don't think he's the norm. But I also want you to hear that I feel like for so many people that are dealing with trauma and that with chronic stress and the effects of their body, this is very often the kind of minimalistic, not really listening sort of view that they get. And this doctor said, I'll tell you what you got to do. You got to put your son on the floor. You got to walk away and you got to pour yourself some wine so you don't feel it and it doesn't bother you anymore. And I was peeved because I wanted to know how to help my son. I didn't want to not feel his pain. I wanted to make him better. And so I think I did what so many moms do, as I did research for myself because there wasn't answers from anybody else. And I took my son and I started doing therapy things with him. I started rocking him in a chair, him and myself, and I started talking to him and telling him his story. You see, that doctor told me he's too little, his body doesn't remember. I would beg to differ. The body always remembers trauma and pain. And so what I did was I connected with him. His mom told the story so she could hear it and so he could hear it. And I started doing things like infant massage to rewire his brain and his body in a way that was safe and comfortable, to start desensitizing him to touch. This was before I knew anything about supplements. I didn't know that, those antibiotics that he was on for his first year of life were really messing with his tummy and therefore really messing with his immune system and therefore were really messing with his neurotransmitter production. I didn't understand that. I just gave him his antibiotics, right? And he needed them. But I didn't know there was a cost to those things. I didn't understand that the stress of the trauma was causing inflammation throughout his system, and that there were things that I could do, through myself by taking certain supplements and then giving him certain things through my milk that would actually help to be protective against so many of the assaults on his brain and his body. But you see, now I do. Now I do know. I do know that our approach to, yes, our food needs to be so dramatically different for people who are under an assault of cortisol. That we need to look at cutting out inflammatory foods, not as a question mark, but if you went to your doctor and the doctor told you you had a heart condition and that you had to be on a special diet that was heart sensitive, I bet you in a heartbeat you would change your diet. We're talking about other parts of your body. We're talking about your gut. We're talking about your brain. That the foods you eat can be a brain-sensitive diet by decreasing the inflammation and the toxic load and processed load of garbage, again, that is hurtful to your body. When we want to heal your body. And this is where I say without question, and this is where I used to tiptoe and tap dance that, supplements. And now I'm like, here's the deal. If I could, I would have every person have access to be able to see a functional medical provider. someone who looks at the whole body and looks at root causes, looks at hormones, looks at blood sugar, looks at inflammation, looks at gut health, understands that they play an enormous role in the wholeness, the whole health of a person. But the reality is this. The reality is that many insurances will not provide coverage when you go to see those doctors. And if you're like me and you live in rural United States, they're not readily accessible, or they're not funded through the state. They can't even bill through insurance. So that creates a dilemma, because that means that there's only a select few people who have access to this type of provider, people who can afford it. And then there's the rest, who honestly are probably people who chiefly need it the most. This is where the snarky skeptic of supplements in me says, okay, I'm going to give you a rundown of the supplements that I use and that I think are imperative in the world of chronic stress and trauma. And then I'm going to say this. If you can take supplements that support you, that protect you, support your immune health, help your detoxification and your cellular aging, help protect your thyroid, help protect your gut, help actually help your brain and your body do the work of repair and energy formation the way that they need, battling enemy number one, right? Chronic stress. And at the same time, share with the people that you love, the people who are also struggling. Like literally, if you were to make a list of people that you know who have kids with special needs, who are on the spectrum, if you were to think about people who struggle with chronic anxiety, depression, who struggle with a history of trauma, who are constantly overwhelmed and overloaded and fatigued, who complain of not being able to sleep and always feeling tired in the morning. If you were to think about the people, right, who are standing in line at the pharmacy for their antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, which I'm not anti those things. I am, however, skeptical that we're diagnosing those things appropriately and that we're always following up, or that we're using the right medication for the right thing. It's kind of a little bit of a crapshoot sometimes. And a lot of really, really intelligent board-certified doctors would say the exact same thing, right? So again, no disrespect, just honest through my perspective. If you could take supplements that did some wonderful things, and you could share them so that they could do wonderful things for other people, and not feel badly about making an income to support your family, to pay for these products. There's nothing arrogant about that. There's nothing smarmy or snarky or gross about that. In fact, I think there's something smarmy and gross and disgusting about some of the things that are happening through our traditional medication, honestly. How they're funded and marketed, right? So I'm going to give just kind of a lowdown on the things that I think are important. I have them all laid out here. And I promise you, not snake oil. I would encourage you, in fact, to do some of your own research. So take out a pen, take out a paper. You have access to look these things up. I'm not making them up. I think first, one of the most misunderstood of the supplements here is this little packet called the Plexus Slim. I hate the name. I hate it. Because for me, what my supplements are so much more than about weight. Because for me, I think weight is so much more than a number. It's actually symptomatic so much of other things that are happening in the body. Okay, so if we could just like get away from the whole number on a scale and inches thing, okay, that would be really great. But what I love about this, and the reason why I take this, my husband takes this, and our 2 children take this every day, has zero to do with weight and has everything to do with the fact of the alpha lipoic acid that works to do 2 things. It works as a detoxifier. So remember, that was one of the things that chronic stress and trauma takes away from the cells, the ability for the liver to do its job of detoxification. And the second thing that I love about it is the blood sugar balance. Again, so many people with chronic stress or trauma have continuous dips and spikes in their blood sugar because of cortisol. This regulates blood sugar all day long. So there's not the dips and spikes of the roller coaster ride, the irritability, the shakiness, the meltdowns. Very often in my office, that's one of the first go-tos when I have somebody that shows up with chronic panic attacks. Or behavioral issues, is I will say, let's do an experiment. And when you notice these dips, these mood variabilities, let's have you have a protein-rich snack, and let's check in about 10 to 15 minutes later and see if you've stabilized, if those panic attacks have decreased, if the mood variability has decreased, because very often it's connected to the blood sugar issue. We don't go a day without this. As a part of that, it's included in a combination called the triplex combo. So with the Slim comes the magnesium supplements for people who struggle with chronic stress, mental health issues, anxiety issues, trauma issues. Magnesium is very important. Again, it can be a magnesium deficiency can be a precursor to things like panic attacks. It can also be linked to things like migraine headaches, restless leg syndrome, difficulty sleeping, all sorts of different things. But the other thing is that the BioCleanse, the magnesium, works to actually help detoxify the body, again, eliminating toxins. Very important. The other product is the probiotic. This is coming from someone who took 5 different probiotics before coming skeptically to Plexus. I'm just going to be honest. Don't mess. Just don't mess. This has the antifungals, the enzymes, the digestive enzymes, the things that actually kill the different sorts of yeast, right? And bad bacteria. I could have a whole talk on fungus and yeast, but I won't, except for you to know that most people that struggle with mental health, as well as most forms of chronic physical health, have an overgrowth of yeast in their belly. Remember, with trauma and chronic stress, the digestive system slows down and acts as a buffet, right, for yeast and bacteria to grow in the belly. And this kills it, eradicates it. And then with the BioCleanse, flushes it out of the system. I want you to know, again, it is very common for people with chronic stress and trauma to struggle with all sorts of gastrointestinal issues, again, including GERD, SIBO, chronic constipation, diarrhea, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, all sorts of different maladies. And those two supplements can be a lifesaver, have been a lifesaver. Also, people on the spectrum tend to have sluggish bowels and lots of gastrointestinal issues. Children on the spectrum, special needs children, tend to have gastrointestinal difficulties. These are a win. These are a win. What else I want to say in the line of probiotics, because upwards of 80, some people say up 95% of our neurotransmitters are made in our gastrointestinal system. So your serotonin, your dopamine, right, your GABA, they're made in your GI system more than your brain. And so what would happen if you actually ingested probiotics, specialized strains that work in your GI system at the source of the problem to help fulfill and give your GI system what it needs? That's what Vital Biome does as a companion to the ProBio 5. Every person, all you have to do is look up the role of omega fatty acid in the world of brain health. And there is a plethora of research that talks about the brain needs omegas, and it cannot get the source of fat from your food. Therefore, you have to supplement. What we all love about Mega X is that it is made from the ahi flour. It is not gross. You're not going to have those fishy burps. So if your kids won't take omega fatty acid because they come in packets that are overly sickeningly sweet, or have a bad aftertaste, or else have fishy burps, I get you. It's disgusting. So Mega X doesn't have any of that. And so many people find that when they take 2 of the omegas, and you might want to talk to the doctor, right, or pharmacist, because if you're struggling with chronic stress or trauma-related symptoms, you might need to take a much higher dose of omegas than the typical person. Again, some pharmacists recommend upwards of 600 milligrams of omega fatty acid per day to give the brain support and protection against the stress. Again, no fishy burps. Lots of people take this and find that they have the most pronounced sleep that they have ever had when they take their omegas before bedtime. Another form of omega fatty acid is, and I think this is kind of like the underscored hero in the world of supplements and our anti-inflammation. You know, it's marketed, the ease, to be kind of like a replacement for standard NSAIDs, pain relievers like Aleve, ibuprofen, that we know are really hard on the body, especially our detoxifying organ of our liver. Well, what I would say is that inflammation is we talked about it. You have chronic stress, you have cytokines released that create inflammation in the body, which kind of are the breeding ground for autoimmune conditions. And more researchers are saying things like depression and anxiety are more linked to things like inflammation through the polyvagal system, including the vagus nerve and its connection to the gut and to the brain, than actually neurotransmitters. And so taking a regular dose of anti-inflammatory when facing ongoing chronic attacks on the brain and the body, I think is pivotal. It's pivotal. It's been proven that anti-inflammatories are actually very helpful for the brain. Again, this is a great source of omegas with New Zealand greenland mussel. This is something that we absolutely don't go a single day without. My husband and I, we both take this. I wish I could get my kids to take it, but because it has New Zealand greenland mussel, it does taste a little fishy. But for me, it is well worth it. Well worth it. There's things that you can do like crack the bottle and store it this way, right? But overall, I would take it in a heartbeat, and if I could sneak it in smoothies for them, I would too. I think, okay. Metaburn. So people are all excited about Metaburn because it helps with metabolism, right? A metabolism booster. And there's so many people that are noticing that it helps with their energy, and they're noticing that they're losing inches, stubborn inches, with abdominal belly fat and the fat around their upper hips and thighs. And so what's the deal with that? The deal with that is because it's actually working to regulate the effects of cortisol. When you see visceral abdominal fat, functional doctors would tell you more often than not that's a sign of out of control cortisol that is creating that specific fat. It actually works in and of itself as a hormone in the body. It's not just neutral hanging on your body fat. It plays the role of an actual organ in your body. And Dr. Daniel Amen, who studies the brain, says that when your abdominal fat, you guys, this is scary. It says when your abdominal circumference rises, your actual brain circumference, especially the prefrontal cortex, shrinks. So there's a direct connection between the visceral belly fat and your brain functioning, putting the brain at higher risk for death, decay, things like Alzheimer's, dementia. This is not a non-issue. This is a big issue. So Metaburn with adaptogenic herbs actually helps to, again, regulate the cortisol balance in the body, which is huge. Now, it does a whole host of other things, like helps with concentration and focus and energy, helps support even things like thyroid functioning, which we talked earlier. The thyroid is one of the chief areas, hormonal areas of our body that gets attacked with chronic stress and trauma. And so taking a supplement that supports that is a win-win. There have actually been people that have noticed feeling incredibly calm, again, less reactive. And I would say that has to do, again, with the cortisol mediation or balancing that is happening. Again, I will say this. We are more than our segmented parts. So, right now our Western culture says you go to your doctor for physical issues, and you go to a mental health clinician or a psychiatrist or psychologist for mental health concerns. And of course, you go to school for academic learning and education, and you go to church for spiritual formation. And so it becomes really natural for us to look at ourselves as these dissected bits and pieces. But we are not dissected bits and pieces. Our mind has everything to do with our body. And our heart has everything to do with our whole selves. And the stories that we carry inside of ourselves have everything to do with every aspect of our being. And what I love about coming to terms and understanding that is that it allows us to be so much more in the driver's seat of caring for our whole self. It's not up to X, Y, and Z professional to tell us what to do. Again, if I have an acute issue, I'm going to go to the doctor. If I break a bone, if I have cancer, a whole host of things, I'm going to go to the medical practitioners. But if I'm struggling with a chronic reoccurrent thing, I'm going to take a look at what might be other parts of the story that are feeding that. And I'm going to at least entertain the willingness to look at what would be quote unquote non-traditional means of care. Because you're worth it. Your whole self is worth it. And there's a whole lot of research. Just because your mental health clinician says that's hocus pocus, just because your doctor says, supplements are a waste of money. Please hear me. Just because they haven't taken the time to read the research doesn't mean that the research isn't plentiful and it doesn't exist. It just means they haven't read it. And it could be because they're busy and buried in a system, right? It could be that it's not the most efficient use of their time to be reading research. It's not efficient. It's time consuming. It's hard to learn new stuff. And most of the people who embrace this way in the medical, the traditional, psychological, even academic circles are the people that went all of the traditional paths and got nowhere fast, that weren't heard, weren't taken seriously, didn't find results. And it's not because they didn't try. They tried so hard and they didn't find answers. And they decided to say yes to something off the beaten path. And they found answers. And now they can't shut up about it. And they don't really care if you think that they're stupid or weird or inconvenient or off the rocker. They don't really care because they feel better. And they're never going back to the way that they once felt. And they don't want you to feel the way that you feel anymore either. And so I would say this to those of you on my team, to those of you who are on my team that are listening later, get over yourselves. Get over yourselves. Get over your fear. Get over your pride. Get over whatever it is that tells you you're not enough, or you're too much, or you don't know enough, or people aren't going to care. The people who need it are going to listen. The people who have tried everything and are despairing and sitting in their doctor's office crying, they're going to care. And you owe it to them to be about their flourishing, to take your broken, messy, jagged-edged, imperfect parts and allow for the Holy Spirit to assemble them in just the right way to offer that other person flourishing. But we got to get over ourselves. We can do that. So this was way longer than normal. I know I kind of went all over the place, a tirade, and I have so much more to say. And it feels very much like I'm speaking a foreign language that I haven't yet learned how to translate for everyone. I'm trying so desperately to find the language that people will understand. Because this is it. This is it. There isn't a day, even outside of my office, if I went to the park with my kids, I could count the number of moms who are struggling with chronic stress. I had a mom text me today, that she's home with her 2 little kids, and she has a couple of weeks off of work, and she's literally like, and when she says this, I know she means it. She's not being funny, that she's losing her mind. She is completely stressed out, overwhelmed, feels like the worst parent in the world. That's chronic stress. Make your list. Who in your life is suffering? And do not allow their saying, I don't have money, because show of hands, who had money for Plexus? I did not have money for Plexus. No, I didn't have money. I don't recommend this, but I kind of do. I didn't tell my husband. That's like the worst, right? And I just bought it like a drug dealer off of a driveway. And I started taking it. And I didn't hide it. I just put it in the cupboard, right? And I took it every day. And then I started feeling good. And then one day my husband opened the cupboard and was like, what is this? And I had to tell him because I wasn't going to lie. And he's like, oh, that's what you're taking that's making you like a human. Yes, you take it too. You take it too. And he did. And he was the one that's like, let's take it. Let's have our kids take it. Right? So do not allow their saying that they don't have money to be the reason. We find a way. We find a way. We find a way for fast food. We find a way for coffee drinks. We find a way to, I had somebody, God bless her, I felt bad. I was like poo-pooing the amount of our products, which by the way, if you look at the ingredients and you went to GNC, we are not inflated. We are not inflated. In fact, the purity of our products, the grade, the degree, how the products are put together to work synergistically to do so many things in the body are at an actual really great price point. But I was feeling like I was assuming and presuming this was going to be a lot of money for her, which is a problem for me, not for her. And she said, Rachel, I quit smoking last year. The cost of these supplements is nothing compared to the cost of my cigarettes. I will gladly pay it to take care of myself. Perspective. Perspective. You know, I love you always. It's time for us to care for our friends and our neighbors better. It's time for us to care for our friends and our neighbors much bolder. For us to care for our moms and our dads and our relatives, our coworkers. Even to be brave and bold and go to those people that scare us. The doctors, the nurses, right? There's a whole lot of them who are in this for the care of their patients. And you never know what doctor or nurse might be sitting across from you who might be in the highest degrees. You think that doctors and nurses don't have chronic stress? You don't think that they don't have compassion fatigue and burnout from working long hours and being away from their families and working overnight shifts? You think that they're not struggling and need what we have? They especially need what we have. So get over ourselves. We've got a world to change. It's our passion. It's our purpose. And God's all in it and of it and through it. So have a good night and take care of yourselves and be brave and go share. And now stop recording.